the mountains so much. And I know that when people mountain climb, what makes it work and what makes it safe is someone on the other end of the line who is holding that line for you. And that is absolutely what has made it possible for us to not only keep the doors open, but continue to take ground, to climb the mountains that have been put in front of us in this place that God has called us to.
It was my junior year of Bible college at North Central University. The missions director pulls me into her office and she says, "Wayne, you've been chosen to represent North Central on a missions trip to New Orleans." I thought to myself, well, if I've been chosen, I should probably say yes. I found out a little bit later that they'd asked 10 other people to go on that missions trip that had turned them down. We arrived here, my best friend and I, and this college student said, "Hey, I want to take you to the French Quarter." But as we got in the car, something came over me and I just started to cry. I didn't know why I was crying, but the closer we got to downtown, the more I cried. I was crying so hard that as we sat down and ordered food, I couldn't even eat. I said, "Hey, I'm gonna go back to the car and I am going to pray and see what God's trying to say to me." I could literally take you to the spot where that car was parked. I remember bawling my eyes out for 2.5 hours and saying, "God, what are you saying to me?" And he kept saying, "Wayne, I'm gonna give you a love for a city like you've never known before." That started this relationship with the city of New Orleans. So here we were in Dallas, Texas. I spent 14 years full-time traveling all over the world as an evangelist. It was an amazing life, but this New Orleans call was still there in front of us.
When Wayne started talking about church planting in New Orleans, I was like, sure. When the kids graduate from high school, and he kept talking about it, pushing it.
It was at General Council 2009, and sitting in that service, God spoke to me and said, "Wayne, it's time to come off the road full time and to move to New Orleans."
We had just moved to Dallas, and now we're living with our best friends 3 houses in front of us, 3 houses to the left of us, and I remember thinking, I am never moving out of this house.
We live in a neighborhood called Harmony. It's literally like God was telling us to leave all of that behind.
And I felt like the Lord spoke to me and said, "Is this all you were made for? Just to live this beautiful suburban life? Or are you willing to do something that's hard and painful and really make a difference?" So I said, "Okay, Lord, I'm willing."
We didn't know, but there was a mountain in front of us that we were being called to climb at just the right time. My heart was full of anticipation as we packed 2 little kids in the car and got ready to move to the city of New Orleans.
So we started trying to find a place to meet. We sold our house at a loss, moved into a dumpy rental.
And we have no idea where we are going to meet as a church. 52 venues turned us down.
Door after door after door was slammed in our face.
But we ended up at a middle school right around the corner.
There was just one major problem. We didn't have any of the stuff that we needed to meet in a school. We thought we were going to be in a theater. All of a sudden, we needed flooring, we needed chairs, we needed about a mile of pipe and drape, we needed stages. We had thought, we don't need the matching funds. We're going to pass on that from CMN. We reached out and said, we're only 2 months from our launch. Could we get the matching funds? And they pushed it through.
On October 2nd, 2011, we launched Saints Community Church.
Around the time that we launched the church, Wayne had always had some asthma, but it started to get really bad. And it was to where he was really struggling to breathe. And it's like he just didn't really recover before another bout would hit.
I woke up one day and I couldn't breathe. That led to a series of sicknesses for years of my life. It was getting staph infections, MRSA, having 18 bouts of pneumonia within a 3-year time span. Doctor after doctor couldn't figure out what to do. Surgery after surgery. To be honest, I'm pastoring the church from my bed, literally walking around with a PICC line that I had to take IV antibiotics.
And he would tuck the PICC line into his shirt and preach, because our goal was, if he could just get out of bed and preach on Sunday, people wouldn't be so scared that the church would just collapse. We realized somebody was going to have to get a job, and so that was me. I ultimately ended up at Capital One as a banker, and I'm getting up early Monday morning after long Sundays, and Wayne was so sick, he would find a way to muster the strength to get up every Sunday and preach, fall back into bed, sick as a dog, and I would get up, take both kids to daycare school, go to the bank, and start all over again the next day. So we went and saw a pulmonologist, and he basically looked at him and said, New Orleans is killing you. You have to get out of New Orleans. You have to leave. And that was really a shock. It had been quite a bit harder than we had expected.
After years of sickness, wondering what in the world was going on, I had this night where I felt the presence of darkness come into the room. And in that minute worth of time where I could feel this darkness, the lies of the enemy began to just run rampant through my head. You're going to leave your wife a widow and die. The lies of the enemy that said the church wasn't going to make it. We weren't going to reach the city. And that my kids were going to be without a father. And I began to ask God a question that maybe I should have asked him a long time ago. And that was, God, why? Why did you move us here? Why the struggle? And I remember God speaking to me in that moment and saying, Wayne, you know you've only ever known 50% of me. I said, God, I don't know what you're talking about. He said, you've only ever known the power of my resurrection. Welcome to the fellowship of my sufferings. I cried out to God in that moment because I realized that each hardship on climbing the mountain, God was teaching me and training me, because we had come to a city where everybody has suffered and we had not suffered before. But God was teaching us how to suffer so we could shepherd a city that was also suffering. I realized in that moment that it was giving me an opportunity to be closer to Jesus than I had ever been before. That although the mountain was still in front of us and the dream had not been reached, that it was going to be worth it, and that God was doing something in each step of the journey on the ascent of that mountain.
At this point, Wayne and I were both just exhausted. We were broke, the church was broke, and around that time, my sister Elizabeth added me to this Facebook group called CMN Wives is what it was called at the time. I got on there and I just poured out my heart. I just said, we're not doing good, and I don't know how we're gonna go on. And that night, like 20 women just poured out love on me and just said, you can make it, you're gonna be okay. And it was the first time. It had been 4 years since we planted, and it was like, we're not alone in this planting thing. And that was my introduction to CMN Women.
During that time that I was so sick, I'd actually returned from a trip, and I had to have emergency surgery on a Saturday night. I was supposed to preach the next morning. We didn't know what to do. I had this amazing leader that had been a part of our team. His name was Daniel Rickett. He and Laura had moved from Illinois.
God actually spoke to me through a dream that we were supposed to come to New Orleans. Wayne and Kristi, I did not know them. The Lord said, I want you to go. I want you to not seek a position, but just to serve. That was the beginning of kind of our call to New Orleans. He was sick, and so he couldn't preach. They asked me if I could speak the next day and support the church in that way during that time.
Daniel and Laura would begin to be such an integral part of what God was doing.
Around that time, we took him back to Mayo Clinic for a second trip. Our church fasted and prayed, and they did find a diagnosis. They found breakthrough medicine, and that is why he turned around. Wayne felt like the Lord really showed him that at the 4-year mark, things were going to change. And right about that 4-year mark, we found a building. It was $1 million. We did not know how in the world we were ever going to be able to buy $1 million building. But right at that time, our district came alongside us and they said, we're going to give you $50,000.
It was as if God was using Pastor Scott Holmes from Louisiana District and the Assemblies of God to say, keep going. This check is a sign that God is faithful and we are with you as well.
And that is actually what convinced the lender that they should lend us the balance. So we moved into that building and we started really having significant growth.
We're going to multiple services. Meanwhile, we're starting to run out of building space. We're having parking issues, kids ministry, problems that we all dreamed of in the early years. A friend of mine takes a position as the pastor at a legacy church with a 32,000 square foot building. God had begun to put our paths together. In January of 2020, we merged with First Assembly of God. We adopted them. We received not only a 32,000 square foot building, we received some amazing saints of God.
Right at that time that we were doing that merge, another pastor came to us that had a multi-site church and said, we want to give you this other site. We want to give you this building in Belchase that's only 7 minutes from your Algiers location.
We stepped out in faith and we knew it was time to start our second location.
We moved out of our little 8,000 square foot building into the First Assembly building and the Belchase building at the same time.
As we knew that God was calling us to start multi-site church with multiple locations, there was no question in my mind who was the couple that we wanted to send, Daniel and Laura Rickett.
Things were going well at the start of 2020, and a few months later, we all know that COVID hit.
None of us knew that COVID was coming.
And, we had to shut down meeting in person for several months.
This amazing, momentous season that we had been in comes to a rapid stop.
When we opened back up, it was kind of like we were opening all over again for now the third time. It just really was a time that was very difficult.
So we make it through COVID-19, reopening our locations. We're getting our feet back under us. God's starting to move again. We have new people coming.
But in August of 2021,
all of a sudden in 2021,
after we had our biggest record-breaking event the Sunday before,
Hurricane Ida is coming. 1
week later, we were hit by Hurricane Ida.
But we do begin tonight with this Category 4 hurricane slamming into the U.S. this Sunday as an extremely dangerous Cat 4 storm, winds reaching 150 miles an hour, unleashing damaging winds, torrential rains, and a life-threatening storm surge.
After being evacuated for a few days, I had no idea what I was going to be driving back into. Trees are down everywhere. There are power lines down everywhere.
The power grid had been destroyed and it looked like it was going to be a long time.
There was no electricity and it was so hot.
We started getting reports about Belchase. Maybe it's not so bad. But then the next report was that it was actually much worse than we had realized.
One of the pockets of our city that had been so greatly affected was that Belchase area.
Direct hit right on top of Belchase. And that storm set over that building and for hours just pounded it. And water just poured into that building for days. And so we realized we have to close. And we thought, yeah, it's going to be rough. We're going to be closed for a couple months. It was going to be a lot longer than a couple months.
To be honest, it became really difficult. It was like a dark moment for us.
Insurance tried to say $125,000 is all we can give you for it. And it was like $1 million worth of damage.
We were really questioning whether to come back or not.
I was very frustrated. God, are you really calling us to do this? Is this really what you had in mind when you asked us to start this church? Just wrestling during that time, like, what are we going back to? The church is kind of destroyed. We kind of knew at that point that it was going to take years.
Like, this is a failure. And it wasn't, but it felt that way.
If it were up to me, I kind of would have called it quits, cashed it in at that point. But we just really sensed God leading us to do the hard work and roll up our sleeves.
We just had this epiphany. New Orleans is home.
For 2 years, our Belle Chase location crowd began to drive over to the Metairie location. For 2 years, we wondered, God, how hard are you going to make this? With fights with the insurance, with renovations that were so much more difficult than you could imagine.
Insurance only covered half of what we needed, but the Lord had made a way. And that's why we just kept putting one foot in front of the other. Is this going to work? And we weren't sure, to be honest.
There were moments where we doubted for sure. I doubted, I know.
And thankfully, they didn't quit, because there is no way we could have ever gone back to Belle Chase if Daniel and Laura had quit. And then they went to launch as we were getting ready to reopen in faith. We didn't know when. And it was like the lights went on. They got a fire in them.
I will never forget as we relaunched that second location, cars having to park down the street, hundreds of people. There were so many children.
They were like, Pastor Daniel, there are people walking down the sidewalk in droves. Like, we don't even have enough seats for everyone. And I was like, yeah, isn't it awesome? Let's help find a place for them.
Oh, it was just a really special moment. It felt in that moment God redeeming so much difficulty.
Yeah.
It was like when we got to the top of that mountain, every hardship along the way had been worth the effort. Everybody that we had tethered to, it had been worth their tethering to us. And we got to celebrate not only with our team from Saints Community Church, but we got to celebrate as a CMN family. We got to celebrate as the Assemblies of God.
Because you can't move up the mountain alone. You have to have people along the way. And that is what the CMN family has been for us. Like, the Lord really spoke to me through Joel chapter 2. We talked about the locusts and how the locusts had destroyed the land, and that God was going to restore the years that the locusts had stolen. That was where the prophetic word about Pentecost came, where he said, on men and on women, I will pour out my spirit. And that's exactly what has happened. We've seen so many people come to the Lord.
In the 3 months that we've been reopened, we've had 94 salvation responses. God's just doing some really incredible things.
Now we think about a third location and a fourth location, and we're going to climb new mountains in the city of New Orleans. We're going to help other church planters climb their mountains in their cities. More ascend moments that we can be a part of along the way.
When you're going up a mountain and you finally get above the tree line and you start to get that panoramic view, you have to stop and recognize those moments. And we're just so grateful. Every piece along the way, the Lord gave us the strength to keep going, to keep climbing. Another voice, another person to help us so that we could see what it looks like from the top of the mountain.